Very much, Big Dad, and thanks for inviting me. What Big Dad didn't say in the introduction was, of course, that the reason we met was on Twitter, where both he and I are fairly active and fairly vigorous, particularly in picking up some of the errors, misconceptions, or indeed outright fabrications that you occasionally read in the press. Something that I hope we will, which is something I admire Mick Dad for, and other people who do it. It does occasionally feel like you're beating your head against a brick wall, but I do think it does actually make a positive difference. Even though sometimes the press is slow to respond, sometimes you see them returning to the same errors again. Nonetheless, I think it is a worthwhile endeavor. Some of you may even have seen I'm sure you saw it, Mick Dad, the report in the Sun earlier this week about car insurance, which I think which goes to show actually that while we may not like the politics or attitudes of the people who run the press and much of what they write, there are people there who are good and honest journalists trying their best to, insofar as they can, to inform the public, and it's our job to continue to support them. Anyway, I will now turn to talking about universal basic services, let's see if I can get this thing to work. Where do I need to point it? Over there? That one. Okay, sorry, wrong way. Before talking about universal basic services and why I think it's an interesting idea which needs to be explored, it's important to set up what we think the problem is. What's the question we're trying to answer? And for that, you need a bit of history. Because what we're talking about here is what's happened to the UK labour market and welfare state over really the past half century or so, and what we think might happen next, what the problems are, both of the present and of the future, and how we might address them. So what's the history here? There was a very sharp rise in inequality in the UK that began really in the mid-1970s. A sharp rise in earnings inequality. And that translated into a much higher level of income inequality in the 80s or 90s. So if you look at any measure of the income distribution in the UK, it was much more equal in the post-war period, up really into to the late 70s than it is now. And under Mrs. Thatcher, effectively, inequality really skyrocketed, and that was driven by a rise in inequality in the labour market. People who earned more did very well. People who earned less did pretty badly. It was also driven by demographic factors, the growth of single-parent families, and at that point, most lone mothers were out of work and therefore poor, and it was also driven by changes to the tax and benefit system, which effectively reduced taxes on the better off people and reduced benefit spending on less well off people. So when the Labour government came to power in 1997, there was they wanted to do something about inequality, and the way they chose to do it was to spend more on benefits, and in particular the vast expansion of the tax credit system, and to pump money into public services. And that was a success up to a point. It did stop inequality rising. Inequality is basically now in the UK, despite what people think inequality has gone up a lot recently. It actually hasn't. Inequality has been up and down, but pretty much flat overall for the last 20 years. It hasn't fallen, but then it hasn't risen again either. So the strategy of Blair and Brown of pumping in money to benefits and to public services did achieve something. It stopped inequality from rising, but it didn't reverse it. And since the 2008-9 financial crisis, this approach, I think, essentially has stalled. The current government has cut back benefit spending again, and of course has cut spending on public services. And so inequality has begun to rise again, not very much yet, but probably going to rise further in the next few years. And moreover, we've seen changes in the way the labor market works. We've seen the growth of what people call precarious work, job insecurity, things like zero-hour contracts, what people refer to as the gig economy. That means that people like Uber drivers and Deliveroo drivers who don't really have a job as such. They're legally self-employed and have none of the security that goes with having a permanent job. And along with that, low productivity in the economy as a whole, which is the reason that wages overall haven't grown very much over the last 10 years. So given all that, what does the future look like? What's going to happen, over the next 10 or 20 years? What we're clearly seeing is a pretty rapid level of technological change. So we've seen increased automation and the increased use of ICT in work. And again, Uber is a good example of that. Uber can only exist because we have the GPS on everybody's smartphone, we have geolocation services, we have the capacity to process large amounts of data. Uber has algorithms which allow it to say where to send a driver when, and so on. So we see automation, but I think what that illustrates is that throughout history, or at least since the Industrial Revolution, people have worried that automation would destroy jobs. There wouldn't be enough jobs for humans. And that goes back, of course, famously in this country to the Luddites who went around smashing up weaving machines because they, not unreasonably, thought that would put them out of a job. But actually, the evidence that job-destroying technological change actually destroys jobs is almost non-existent. And in fact, there are lots of jobs in the UK. There are more jobs in the UK than in recorded history. So far, technology hasn't destroyed jobs. What it does, though, and again, Uber and others like their example, is that for some people at least, it does seem to result in high levels of low-wage or low-skilled employment, lack of job security, and a lot of churn for people in low-skilled employment. So technology doesn't destroy jobs overall, but it appears so far, at least the sort of technological change we're having here, benefits people at the top. Most obviously, it benefits a very small number of people who invent new technologies, set up companies, and take the benefits. So there's a small layer of people at the top who benefit a huge amount. There's a bigger layer of people below that who don't necessarily have an ownership in this new technology but benefit from the sort of high-skilled, high-productivity jobs that it creates. And frankly, people like me, and I suspect at least some of you in this room, if you work in anything like finance, for example, are also in that layer. But there's a worry that quite large sections of society will not benefit and will actually do worse. And then in some medium and high-skilled workers will also be vulnerable over time, risk being displaced from one group down to the lower one. So what I, as a labour market economist, worry is not so much that, as everyone says, that the robots are coming to take all our jobs. That hasn't happened in history, and I don't think there's any particular evidence or reason to believe it's going to happen now. But I do worry that there'll be continuing high levels of earnings equality, even worse perhaps than we have now. And that will make it very difficult to finance the welfare state, even on the current stripped back model, because it gets harder and harder to tax highly skilled, potentially highly mobile people, and it gets even harder to tax the sort of wealth and capital that is accumulated by people who own these firms, and the fact that we effectively have very, very low tax rates on companies like Apple, Amazon, and Facebook, which are making very, very large profits, is illustrative of that. At the same time, in countries like the UK, we'll have very serious demographic pressures as we get older. Now, the fact that we are getting older and that we can live longer, often live longer more healthily, is in itself a good thing. It's not, again, this is technology is overall expands the opportunities that are available to us, but there are economic consequences, and the economic consequences here are, again, that we need to think again about how the financing and structure of the welfare state. So what then are the potential options? And I sort of group these into the ones that are mostly on the table into three options. The first is what I would call accommodation. In other words, we just say, this is capital. This is what modern capitalism looks like. That's life. It's too hard to do anything about it. If that leads to uncomfortable extremes of wealth and income, well, that's what the market says. And of course, we'll continue to have some sort of welfare state and safety net, but we will essentially respond to it as Thatcher did, and say we will go in that. We'll let the market push us in that direction. The second approach is to try and go back at least to what Blair and Brown tried to do in the 2000s, and McDad said, I was part of that. I was a senior civil servant for most of that period, and I worked on a lot of the policies, and I don't regret any of that. I think it was broadly the right thing to do. But as I said before, I think we are sort of running out of road on that. It's increasingly difficult to sustain that politically or economically. It's increasingly difficult to make the tax numbers add up. And the political support for massive redistribution through systems like the tax credit system doesn't exist in the same way that it did then. Maybe that will change, but I think we would be unwise to count on it. The third, and I think, Mitad, you said you've already had a talk on basic income. So when I talk about basic income or universal basic income, who was it? Right. Okay. Now, universal basic income is an idea that has a lot of has attracted an awful lot of attention in the last couple of years. Not that much has actually happened. There are a few experiments going on around the place, including in Scotland and Finland and so on. And it does have some clear attractions, as you probably heard. It's simple. It can improve work incentives, and it gets away from some of the means testing apparatus of the welfare state. But there are pretty serious problems with universal basic income. First of all, there's a fundamental political problem of whether it's remotely politically feasible in anything like the sorts of ways that its proposers set it out. But also, the problem is that if you set basic income at a very low level, then it really doesn't change very much. It doesn't, if people can't survive on it at some decent level, then it doesn't simplify the system, because you still need other top-ups and so on. It doesn't really improve incentives that much, and it's just another layer on an existing system. If you set it at a level that is high enough for people to actually live on, to actually fulfill the vision of the economists who first started thinking about basic income, then it is either hugely expensive or quite regressive. In other words, either you have to make some people at the lower to middle end quite a bit poorer, which isn't terribly attractive if the idea is to make the country more equal, or you end up with quite high, very expensive basic income that leads to quite high tax rates at the other end. And then maybe that's a good thing, but it involves some fairly politically unpalatable choices. Moreover, and I think this, for me, is the big issue with basic income in the UK context, and I say this as somebody who spent an awful lot of time working on the welfare system when I was in government. What people generally don't realise is that when it comes to paying benefits to people who are of working age, in other words, benefits apart from the state pension, we really don't pay very much to unemployed people at all. there aren't that many unemployed people. We don't give them that much money. The vast majority of the money that we spend on people of working age goes to either disabled people or people who have very high housing costs through housing benefit. And how does a basic income address those questions? Well, the point about a basic income is that it's unconditional. The point about disability benefits is that they are conditional. They're conditional on you being disabled. So if you want a basic income, you have to make a choice. Either you say, right, we're not going to have a disability test anymore. We just give everybody the same, regardless of whether or not they're disabled. In other words, you're having a substantial redistribution of money from disabled people to non-disabled people, which is not a very attractive proposition at all. Or you end up reintroducing a disability test through the back door, which means that you fail to tackle the single most politically difficult, the single most administratively difficult, the single most painful, and single most immoral, in some people's view, aspects of the current system. So you dodge that problem. And the second problem is housing costs. Well, some people live in places which are expensive and some people don't. We deal with that through housing benefit at the moment. Again, you have a choice. You can either say, well, there's no reason why we should subsidize people effectively to live in London and other high-cost areas, and say that everyone gets the same and has to pay for their housing out of that. In that case, you're giving a windfall gain to lots of people who live in relatively cheap areas of the country, and you're essentially saying to people on low incomes in London, get out, we can't afford you anymore. Or you reintroduce some sort of housing-related means test again, and then, again, you failed to solve the other big complication of the current system. So the big problem for basic income for me, and I think for a number of other people who work on Social Security, is that attractive as it may be, it doesn't actually deal with the central, the really difficult aspects of the current system. It deals with the issue around work-related conditionality and incentives for the unemployed, but that's actually a relatively small part of the public of the issue and the problem. So the alternative approach, which I and some colleagues have been discussing, was what we have called, slightly concrete, universal basic services. That is the direct provision of public services at or close to free at the point of use to everybody. So basic services and universal meaning provided to everybody. So first, I think, and remember, this, we presented a bit, and it sounds a bit like a very radical idea, but of course we already have some universal basic services. The National Health Service is a universal basic service. It's free. We provide it to everybody. We don't charge for it. Similarly, primary and secondary education are currently universal basic services. Tertiary and higher education aren't. Those are broadly historical accidents to some extent, the reason we provide certain services for free and certain we don't. So I think it's helpful to stand back and think a bit about why do we provide public services? What are the reasons for providing public services at either a subsidized cost or at zero cost? And there are economists talk about sort of several different ones. I mean, the first is externalities and spillovers, right? So we educate people in part because we think actually having a bunch of people who've never been to school running around the country is not only going to be bad for them, but actually going to be bad for the rest of us. So there's a common interest in ensuring that everybody has at least some basic level of education, which we've chosen at the moment to define as being educated up to the age of 18. The second is economies of scale and scope. Some things are better provided are easier to provide collectively by the state because they're natural monopolies of one sort or another. That, of course, can change over time. It was clearly the case once that telephone services were a natural monopoly and should be provided by the state because otherwise it would have been a mess. It's no longer the case. There's no particular reason that telecom services should be nationalized. Imperfect information, moral hazard, all the reasons why, basically these are the reasons why markets don't work very well or may not work very well. This is particularly the case for the National Health Service, and these are the reasons why purely private healthcare markets basically don't exist anywhere in the world. Where they do, they don't work very well. because people don't genuinely have either the information or the motivation or the incentives to make informed decisions about their own healthcare. So we tend to think that there is a role for the state in at least regulating and in this country providing healthcare. And finally, there's the more nebulous and less economic one of common culture, citizenship, and values. It's actually quite interesting the way, for political scientists, of which I'm not one, the way in which the NHS in this country, which you can justify in purely economic terms, just say, well, the types of market failure, the way the political economy of the NHS and so on justifies it being provided as a state-owned, free at point of view service. That's a perfectly good economic justification for the NHS. There are arguments for and against that, and hardly anyone argues for a purely private system, but people argue for different varieties of public service provision. But over the last few years, a lot of the discussion about the NHS actually focuses on, not just from the economic point of view, but talks about it as being an expression of our common citizenship, common values. I mean, we saw that very much in the Olympic ceremony, but you also see it in quite a lot of political discussion that the NHS is a sort of symbol of what we think a slightly nicer Britain ought to look like. And that's obviously also true of the education system. We expect the education system to play a role, not just in addressing the economic aspects of economic externalities, but also providing the common good of instilling some degree of common culture, citizenship, and values in young people. And if there's something that underpins all of this, some of you heard of Amartya Sen, the great Indian-British economist who won the Nobel Prize a few years back, and his concept of the capabilities of approach, that the role of the state is to redistribute income and to reduce inequality, but that's only a sort of means. The objective, the sort of philosophical objective of the state is to ensure that everyone has the ability to participate fully in society, what he called the capabilities approach. So that doesn't require perfect equality, but it does require that the state ensure that people have their one way or another have their basic needs met, but more than that, not just the safety net, but that they are able to participate fully in whatever that society has to offer. That doesn't mean they have to take advantage of every opportunity society has to offer, but that those opportunities should be open to them, and that economic constraints should not debar them from making the most of themselves within the context of that society. And I think it's that actually that sort of underpins underpins a lot of the rationale behind going for, in my view, a welfare state that focuses more on the provision of services rather than simply on the provision of money. That if you want to break down people's barriers to participation, it doesn't mean you don't need income cash benefits for people who are unemployed, disabled, in need for whatever reason, but it means that in itself is unlikely to be enough. If you want to give people the opportunity to fully participate, you need to break down their barriers to participation, and that's part of what we're talking about. I shall probably skip over. This is just a graphic one of us put together on some of the particular issues that you might be worried about in the current context. So we have a very high level of child poverty, 4 million people, and rising, and likely to rise significantly further over the next few years as further cuts to social security spending come into force. We have, you may well have seen yesterday, the latest figures on homelessness showed that rough sleeping has roughly doubled in the last 7 years. The number of people who, both in London and in the rest of the country, the number of people who have to sleep rough has doubled. That's a symptom of a wider housing crisis. We have about 8% of the population is in what is officially described as food insecurity. That is, they have occasional or regular difficulty in feeding their families one way or the other. And we have a fairly wide divide around things like the use of the internet. So 1 in 5 people who earn under 20,000 never use the internet, as opposed to almost nobody who earns more than £40,000 or so. So what then would a welfare state, reshaped at least partially along the lines we envisaged, look like? Well, we wanted to do more than just, I mean, I think it's important to emphasize in what I'm going to say next that this is very much a sort of early stage attempt at putting some flesh on the bones. We're not putting forward a blueprint for a new welfare state. Equally, we wanted to go farther than simply saying, wouldn't it be nice if the state provided some more services, and actually put some flesh on the bones by focusing on some very specific things that we could say, if we did this, it would cost this, it would have this sort of effect, it could be financed this way. So these are worked examples as opposed to a full blueprint for reshaping the welfare state, but they sort of illustrate the sort of things that could be done. So what do we try and cost here? And again, these are very much centered around capabilities, about giving people the ability to participate fully in society, starting with public transport. It's very difficult to live, it's not you can live without moving around, but it's very difficult to participate in society in the UK if you can't access transport, and transport is quite expensive in large parts of the UK. So if we extended the Freedom Pass to everybody, if people could simply move around London and their localities essentially for nothing, that would, I think, promote a degree of mobility, a degree of mixing, a degree of ability to participate that doesn't exist for large numbers of people at the moment. Second, and perhaps even more important, information, access to a basic, to say that in 21st century Britain, the idea that you're going to be able to get a job, to shape your career, to shape your life without having basic internet access no longer makes sense. Society has changed. When I grew up, of course, this was not the case. You didn't need the internet to participate fully in society or find a job, but you do now. People without smartphones aren't going to be able to have access to the same range of job or life opportunities as the rest of us. So ensuring that everybody has access to a basic mobile and internet plan and television, again, seemed to us to be a sort of precondition for participation. Third, food, and I think this is pretty obvious, and I think it's important to say here, when we talk about universal basic services here, we're not talking about nationalising Tesco's. We're talking about providing food free to people who need it. And I think this is an important point. I mean, people say, well, you must. This is nonsense, right? You're not suggesting universal provision of food, and we say we're suggesting that everybody who wants food for free should be able, if they want to access it. But that doesn't mean we expect most people to access it. And I mean, you do get people even now saying, well, of course the demand for food banks has gone up. If you offer something for free, people will take it. In my view, this is complete nonsense. I mean, I could go to a food bank if I wanted to and they would give me food, but I don't, because I don't need it. It's neither something I want to do, nor need to do, nor would be moral for me to do. And I think that's true of the vast majority of people. So extending the food bank service, ensuring that we had food banks everywhere they were needed and that people had access to them, doesn't mean feeding everybody in the country. It just means that when people need it, there is a basic nutritious meal that they can go out and get if they need it. Just as for the fact that we provide free wheelchairs doesn't mean that everybody goes out and get a wheelchair. I mean, if you really wanted to go and get a free wheelchair, you could probably persuade someone to give it to you. It's not that hard, but people don't, because that's not what people do. And I think the same is so. It's important to recognize that universal basics. Similarly, actually, for our provision of a basic mobile plan. I think if you say to people, well, you can get a basic limited mobile and limited internet plan for nothing, many people, those of us who, people who, especially younger people, not me, but people who like to watch films streamed on their mobiles or whatever, will still pay more if they to get that. So again, you're not providing everything for free. You're just ensuring that people who need it can get it. And finally, and again, this is clearly not a universal service, but this is simply an attempt to address the current lack of provision. We costed the cost of building 1.5 million new social housing units, which would would not necessarily solve the housing crisis overnight, but would go a very, very long way to ensuring that the current deficit we have in housing provision was largely met. So what would that cost? Well, we estimate, looking at the cost of the first three and the financing cost, because it's a capital investment, obviously, than the current spend, the cost of this would be 2.3% of GDP. That's about £42 billion. That sounds like a lot of money. It is a lot of money. It's not, however, a ridiculous amount of money by the standards of it would involve putting taxes up by a noticeable amount, but not by a huge amount. We could do it by reducing the personal allowance back down to £4,000. You could do it by increasing VAT by another few percent. It would be a noticeable tax increase, but it would not require a revolution in the UK tax system. And of course, if we could do something about taxes paid by large corporates, that would also go some way towards improving matters as well. As this shows, this would be a fairly redistributive. This would have a pretty significant impact on equality, income inequality. It would benefit people at the lower end very considerably more, as we've costed it. Now, everybody would benefit to some extent from the provision of services. Of course, for people at the top end, this would be more than offset by the increased taxes that they'd have to pay, which we haven't illustrated on that. But again, we're not talking about huge tax increases in terms of percentages of income for people at the upper end, but we are talking about quite large increases in income for people at the lower end as a percentage of their income. So this would be a significant degree of redistribution. It would probably reverse most of the reduction in redistribution that we've seen over the past 7 years and take us back more like to something that we saw in the late 2000s. So it would be a major change, but not a revolution. But in contrast to a proper full-fledged basic income, it would not require a complete re-engineering either of the benefit system or the welfare state more broadly. So I'm going to wrap up there. As I said, this is still very much work in progress. We hope to do more. We're trying to interest people in various parties in these ideas. We do think it offers a more pragmatic, short-term solution to some of the problems of inequality and the welfare state than the basic income. And we do think that it also, over the long term, is the sort of thing that addresses some of these longer-term problems in the labour market and society that going back to where I started, that we ought to be worried about. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
We have time for questions.
The £42 billion that you mentioned, is that a per annum figure?
Yes. Yeah, that's per annum. Yeah. So yeah, it's not a small amount of money, but it's not. Again, it's not a. It's not a massive amount of money either, right? It's 2% of GDP. We currently. Taxes and spending are both currently at about 36 to 38% of GDP. So you're talking about another 2% on top of that in taxes and in spending.
But if you did spend that, would the outcome of that be that, ultimately it'd be offset by maybe people claiming less of other tax allowances? I mean, I'm not familiar with the welfare system, but is there potential for that?
Well, I mean, there are sort of second-order effects in the sense that, to some extent this money some of this gets spent on things, then people pay. If you buy food, for example, if the government subsidizes food banks and they buy food, then some of that comes back via VAT to the exchequer. So there are always sort of second round effects. We haven't tried to calculate that. We'd hope they would be positive. If you go out and build a large number of social houses, you stimulate the economy in various ways. We haven't tried to calculate the wider macroeconomic impacts, but you'd hope that there would be some positive feedbacks from all of this.
So actually, the net cost could be less than what you stated.
You could hope that it would be. We're not counting on that here.
Thank you. Sorry I missed the beginning of your talk, so I apologize if you covered this already. I read part of the paper that was published by UCL on this, and my question is around how do you take this forward in terms of convincing the public that it's a good idea and changing the kind of political will, so to speak, in order to kind of make this a reality?
Well, of course, I do have a stock answer to this question because people ask me it to me all the time when I talk about immigration, and the stock answer is, of course, that if I knew how to do that, I might be a politician rather than an economist. And I think our view is that we have to start by convincing this is early days yet, and you have to start by convincing people who are interested in this, i.e., people who are interested enough to come to a meeting like this on a Friday night, or MPs or journalists who actually know what they're talking about in this area. And it's only once you get that critical mass of people who are interested and engaged in this sort of ideas, you can then go out and work out, well, given that, how do you actually convince the public about it? But I think, there is more of a market for this than there was, say, and this goes back to what I said before about redistribution, which through the tax credit system having been the right way to go in the 2000s, but the political economy has changed. I think there is more of a market for it now for this sort of thing now than there was 5 years ago. I think people realize that the welfare state is getting frayed around the edges. I think, I remember when I was when we were doing some stuff on poverty and how people perceived it 10 years ago when I was at DWP, most people in focus groups didn't really think that you needed a mobile not to be poor, right? Now I think, and I'm pretty sure that the latest research bears this out, people actually think, well, no, that's no longer true. Society has changed, technology. So I think there is more of an acceptance that some of these things are needed to participate in society. Similarly, I think that the fact that we do have food banks now, and people do generally think, no, the state shouldn't be allowing that to happen. So I think there is more. How you actually turn that into a political critical mass, I say, is sort of beyond my expertise. But I think there's more of a chance than there was a few years ago.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, thank you very much for your speech. The idea about universal basic services takes me back to the time where we're talking about Marxism, yeah? Okay, and the political thinking now is to increase allowances for the basics so that the lower paid are not taxed as much. So it's a reverse of what you basically said.
Yep.
So you claim that there's more uptake on this idea. Where have you found that information from? How do you feel that that's the case?
Well, I think the fact that actually in the last election, quite a large proportion of the population did vote for a party whose chancellor is certainly considerably influenced by Marx, shows that there's probably more appetite than I would have, if you'd asked me a year ago, more appetite than I would have guessed, certainly. I think, but more broadly, I think, these ideas are just generally more in play. There is more of a spectrum of what's acceptable for debate has widened considerably in the last few years. Again, when I was doing work within government, there was a fairly strong consensus around a fairly narrow set of ideas. There was and since then it's expanded in both directions. We've had a government which has been quite prepared to impose cuts on disability benefits, for example, which were unthinkable 10 years ago. At the same time, I think, the fact that renationalization of quite a large number of major industries is hugely popular in the country is something that wasn't the case 10 years ago. So the spectrum of what's acceptable, what you can talk about and get a hearing in politics, and this goes to what I was saying to the previous questioner, has widened. I think as well, your specific point about about raising allowances, I think again, people have begun to see through that a bit, frankly. It was quite an effective political strategy for this government in the first few years. I think people have realized that actually, it's not a particularly progressive measure. Most of the benefit doesn't go to low-paid people as a matter of arithmetic. Most of the benefit goes to middle and upper income earners. And it certainly hasn't done anything to address the sort of broader problems with housing, with food security, with disability and so on that I think people are mostly worried about. No.
How about now?
A little bit better, but it might speak up a bit.
Okay. I apologize, I'm losing my voice. I sort of want to bring this back to the question of disability. As you can see, I'm in a wheelchair, but as I was falling unwell, I was able to still work for a while, and I did work briefly or intern at DWP. And I remember as the austerity was being rolled out, walking through departments full of empty chairs, effectively, as people were being sacked from their jobs. A bit like that scene Up in the Air, if you saw that film, it was heartbreaking to see. And then, as I got progressively more ill to the point I was about 98% bedridden, couldn't sit up, I had an exchange with one of the ministers then at DWP, who, when I wrote to him via my MP, complaining about the fact that there were proposed cuts to disability benefit, which I and countless others relied, he said, we need to make sure that the taxpayer gets his value for money, or value for his money. And I thought, interesting. But whatever happened to the social compact? Now, I know you're not a politician, but I'm curious, well, two questions, as to what it is that drives people, in your view, to a model of austerity, effectively. It drives people to these parties that, lead untenable governments, effectively untenable economies. And secondly, what do you make then of this Marxist-influenced party? Although in some respects they seem very Keynesian, and Paul Krugman had similar ideas, a few years ago, 10 years ago, in terms of how to get us out of a recession or depression. What do you think of those models in terms of what is pragmatically acceptable to the populace?
Okay, so, austerity first. I think that austerity was sold to the British public as being sort of a necessary fact of life, right? That they were not, that it was the Conservative Liberal coalition, with the largely complicity of the press, succeeded in selling it as something to which there was no alternative. We have to live within our means, we have to balance the books, therefore we have to cut public spending, etc., etc. Now, there was a certain amount of truth in that, the economic situation did change very radically from 2008 to 2009. That meant changes had to be made. But there were a lot of choices about how you did it, whether you did it through taxes or spending cuts, if you were going to cut spending, what you cut spending on, and all the rest of it. For various reasons, the weakness of the opposition, the nature, the way the press presented and so on, those choices were never really, I think, put or understood. That's part of it. But the second part of it, I think, is that, and this is what I was referring to before when I said that redistribution through tax credits and benefits, which I as I say, I worked on a lot in the 2000s, did become much less politically popular after the financial crisis. And for whatever reason, and I don't think it's just because people were being manipulated. People decided, times are tight, we have to cut back. I don't want my money being spent on people who are unemployed or ill or disabled or whatever. And that's partly, I think, because people, a lot of people are able to separate out what they what's actually happening at a national level from what happens to actual individuals. If you, I don't know the details of your particular, your case, but there are thousands and thousands of examples of people who were wrongly kicked off disability benefit, as you know, and most people, regardless of how they vote, regarded that as pretty awful. But they didn't really connect those individual stories with the wider political context or the wider context of austerity. Sorry, that's only a partial answer, but and again, to try and be a bit optimistic, I think that disconnect is beginning to erode a bit. I think our people are beginning to realize a bit more what the sort of human consequences are of some of the measures that were taken over the last 5 years. I think it was Stephen Bush writing in the New Statesman said a couple of days ago that, and this is a pretty cynical political journalist take on it, frankly, but it's, look, in the first few years, the Conservatives were able to cut the deficit by hitting mostly people who lived in areas that voted Labour, but now as things get harder, they're starting we're seeing the impact of austerity on things like the National Health Service and care for the elderly and so on, and that actually hits everybody, and hence people begin to realize that that the impacts do affect them directly or indirectly, as well as people who they don't know. So that's austerity on Labour, and yes, I don't think there's any sense in which the Labour Party's manifesto in the last election was Marxist or anything like it. It was very much a sort of, in macroeconomic terms, it was very much a sort of moderate Keynesianism to which people like Paul Krugman and I broadly subscribe. So in macroeconomic terms, I think that's right. I personally, what disappointed me about it was the focus on nationalisation of things like water, electricity, and rail. Not necessarily because I think these are inherently dreadful ideas. There is a case for nationalising the water, renationalising parts of the water industry, for example, which hasn't been terribly well run in the private sector. But just because I sort of think it misses the point, the challenges of the future are not about whether water is provided by the public sector or the private sector. The challenges of the future are about who controls the flow of information, who controls actually what Google and Facebook and Apple, how they manage our data, how they control and market to us. And unfortunately, I didn't think the Labour manifesto really addressed what I regard as the future challenge. But I'm wandering a bit off the subject, so I'll shut up now. I hope to be doing some more work on that at some point in the next couple of years.
Quick question from me. What do you consider to be the top level of sustainable public sector spend as a proportion of your GDP? So you said it's about 37, 38 at the moment. Historically, obviously, it's had its much higher numbers in earlier years. It's gone down to that level. If we're talking about an extra couple of percent here, if, for example, Labour were to be in power, they obviously want to spend another couple of percent, albeit covered through their own. That's coming up to 42, 43, and then NHS needs to probably be funded a bit more than it currently is, get rid of austerity, and suddenly you're going to get up to 45. Do you think there's a limit to what is a long-term politically palatable or useful or economically the right thing to do?
I don't think there's a. I mean, ultimately there is a limit to what's sort of economically sustainable. I don't think we're anywhere near it. There probably is a political limit, but it does depend very much on the composition, and it depends on the times. You know, these things change. It's a moving target. So, you know, I wouldn't put a number on it. I mean, I think you could certainly you could get away with something higher than we have now. I think, you know, there people would be perfectly willing to pay somewhat more tax for the NHS. They'd be willing to pay somewhat more tax for things that they thought they got value from. But it's clearly not unlimited. I mean, there are, and ultimately, you know, you have to make choices. You have to say what your priorities are. I do think but I guess more fundamentally, my view on this, and this goes back again to the sort of political economy of this, is that you have to force people to have to and this is what politicians, for obvious and understandable reasons, but ultimately very damaging ones, fail to do, is you do have to confront people with the trade-offs. So the NHS is a good example. I mean, at some point, you have to, given the demographic pressures, you have to say to people, well, you know, we have a choice. We can continue to underfund the NHS as we are now, in which case this will just get worse and worse, or we can spend more public money on it, in which case your taxes are going to have to go up, or we can introduce some form of private or social insurance provision, in which case your taxes won't go up, but you'll have to pay money through another scheme, and that will have, you know, you may have slightly more control or choice, but equally there will be some inefficiencies and possibly inequities that come with that, as there are in other social insurance type systems. And, you know, which of these options, which of the options you want to take? None of these are cost free. None of these are painless. But you know, as has been frequently quoted in other contexts, you know, you can't. Politicians can tell you that you can have your cake and eat it, but they can't actually deliver on that over the long term. So, you know, to me, it's not a question of saying, well, there's an upper limit of 40% we have to fit, or whatever, 42%, whatever we have to fit under that. It's saying it's public saying, well, you know, we're going to have to spend more money on healthcare one way or the other. So how would you like to finance it? What are the trade-offs involved in financing it in different ways? You know, we could put up taxes, but, you know, that's going to be painful. Or we could do this. That's also going to be painful. But, you know, ultimately not having healthcare is going to be even more painful.
Thank you very much for your talk. Just one small observation and one question. When you were saying that people say that if you have free food banks, everybody will go and get it. I look at the example of cheap NHS glasses. I don't think more than 1 or 2% of the people take this. They decide to pay whatever they want to get whatever. So I think it's going to work like that. This is how human nature operates. And I think there is a lot to say that whilst these services are there so that nobody is deprived of it, people will then decide what level they want to pitch themselves at. My question is, to get more acceptance of these ideas, do you think that hypothecated taxation may work better?
Hypothecated taxation is you know, earmarking particular taxes for particular spending programs is a tough one. You know, economists tend not to like it for reasons that you know. I mean, I think it doesn't solve all the problems, but there probably is a political case for it. Certainly for the NHS, you know. I mean, one of the ways of addressing the trade-offs problem is to say and of course, Brown didn't hypothecate tax, but he did very explicitly say we are putting up national insurance by 1% in order to fund an increase in NHS spending, and that actually, from a political point of view, that was reasonably successful. So going a bit further and saying we'll have some form of hypothecated tax dedicated to NHS, I think, you know, it does raise all the sort of technical issues that you will know about, but it's probably worth trying. What you don't want to do is, I think, have 27 different hypothecated taxes for 27 different spending programs, because I think that does become unmanageable and loses credibility.
So my question is a very simple one. In terms of percentage of the GDP, if all the likes of the Apple and the Google and the Amazons of the world were to contribute in a fair way, whichever method finally they succumb to, what percentage would it contribute? I mean, would it be 2%? Are we talking about 10% or what?
Well, you tactfully describe that as a simple question, but of course it's not a simple question at all. It's an incredibly complicated question on which tax lawyers and economists will argue for forever. I mean, I think what would sort of be realistic? Well, if, for example, you can, I don't have the numbers to hand, but if you think, for example, that online shopping is up to 15 or 20% of all shopping, Amazon has a large share of that, it doesn't pay taxes. If it paid taxes at the rate of bricks and mortar retailers paid, you could be talking about, I mean, I think realistically, you'd probably be talking about a couple of % of GDP. I do think it's important to say that, in my view, is these companies certainly are evading or sort of avoiding tax in a way which we should not allow them to get away with. But on the other hand, there is some rhetoric, including from the likes of Mr. McDonnell, that sort of says, if we could just tax them properly, there'd be no problem and ordinary people wouldn't have to pay any more tax. And I think that is wrong, actually. There just is, there isn't enough money there to solve all the problems, first of all. And second, to some extent, if you tax them more, some of those costs would be passed on to the consumer. So if you taxed Amazon more, yes, you would hit their profits and their shareholders, but also they'd probably raise their prices, and those of us who use Amazon a lot would end up paying a bit more. So I do think we should be doing a lot more. And to be fair to this government, they are beginning tentatively to try and do some more, but we shouldn't count on more than 1 or 2% of GDP. And even that will probably take a degree of international coordination with other countries, which we don't have yet. And it doesn't get away from the point that I was making to Mikdad, that ultimately there are trade-offs. People have to accept that you can't say, oh, we could solve all our problems if these nasty rich companies paid all their taxes and I won't have to pay any more taxes. That in itself isn't going to do it.
Final question, if there's anyone. Okay, sorry. Okay.
Yeah, no.
Hello. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So you mentioned the NHS
Yeah.
because it's very topical at this seasonal time, but we have an issue with education as well.
Yes.
Well, because education is a route out of poverty for many people.
Yeah.
So how much percentage on the GDP will that take?
I'm not sure that education needs a. I'm not sure that education necessarily needs a huge amount more money. It needs some more money, and the last government invested a lot in improving the capital stock of our schools, and this government hasn't. So we've fallen a bit behind on that. But mostly when I talk to people in education, at least in the primary and secondary schools, mostly what they're fed up of is politicians interfering and messing around and changing the rules and the measurements and the systems every 2 years and generally faffing around. And actually, the last education secretary, Justine Greening, who was sacked unceremoniously, was remarkably popular among the education profession, not because she did anything terribly radical to boost expenditure, but simply because she didn't do anything very radical at all. She just said what the system needs is a period of stability. So I think a bit more money would probably help education, but actually a period of stability, focus on not lots of reforms, but simply addressing some of the more deep-rooted problems in particular areas in schools is probably what the education system needs now. So I don't think there's a huge...
There has been a public pay freeze for the last 7 years.
Yes.
Which is quite a significant.
Yes, and we're going to have to... I mean, pay is going in the public sector is going to have to rise again. So I don't think there's any doubt about that, or we will continue to lose people. But it doesn't necessarily need to rise significantly faster than GDP. I mean, pay has been rising much slower than GDP. If it were to rise simply in line with GDP in the future, that would be a start. That would be a considerable change from now, but it wouldn't lead to any net increase in the proportion of GDP taken by public sector pay, obviously.
Thank you very much. I think we're going to end there.